Hi, I'm Arnie Skelton, and each week in this podcast series I'm going to offer you my top 10 tips on particular topics or themes that might be of interest to you as a teacher or manager or both. Hi, and thanks for joining me on this week's podcast, which is all about micro behaviours. Let me start by giving you a little bit of a puzzle. Do you know what these 6 letters mean? LT, MA, BD. I'll say them again. LT, MA, BD. It's a phrase I use quite a lot because it means little things make a big difference. And that's the essence of micro behaviours. A micro behaviour is something we present or use in any conversation or engagement with any other person. They're the little things that we do or say that can make a really big difference. And that's this week's top 10. So, let's start with tip number 1, which is active listening. Active listening means showing the other person that you are listening, not just sitting there, not looking away, but looking at the other person. Eye contact, showing that you're listening by looking at the other person. Nodding, making occasional noises such as, yep, okay, fine, sure. And paying attention. I think that phrase is really important. It's an investment you're making in the other person, and it shows the other person that you're engaged. It values the other person. You turn fully to look at that person. Not just turn the sideways look of your head, but turn your body round to face the other person. All of those things would be categorized as active listening, showing the other person that you're engaged. So that's tip number 1, active listening. Tip number 2 is asking questions. When we engage with somebody, essentially we have one of 2 options: to ask questions or to make statements. You make a statement which, if you wrote it down, would end in a full stop. And a statement is passing on information, giving information, providing the other person with answers or facts. And essentially that makes the listener fairly passive. They're just listening to what you have to say. As soon as you ask a question, on the other hand, you engage the other person. It involves them. We're hardwired as humans to answer questions. So, for example, if I ask you the question now, what's the colour of your front door? It's really hard not to give me an answer. Even if you don't tell me, that's where your mind will go. I wonder what the colour... Oh, yeah, it's green. Oh, it's red. We're hardwired to answer questions. So, the power of questions is severalfold. First of all, it provides the agenda that the other person is going to work on. So whatever it is they're thinking about at any given time, the question you ask will change the agenda to whatever your question is about. So let me prove that now. If I say to you, where did you last go on holiday? That's probably what you're now going to be thinking about. What did you last eat? You're now going to be thinking about that. What's your favourite car or vehicle? You're now thinking about that. It's very unlikely you were thinking of any of those 3 issues before I asked the question. So, questions are really useful in setting agendas, in getting the other person to think about and then talk about whatever it is you think is important. So questions help shape the agenda for you and the other person. And of course, they involve the other person. It makes the conversation more two-way to have questions followed by answers. Both parties are involved equally and are equally active. So, tip number 2, ask questions. Tip number 3 is use your body language effectively. Body language is how we present ourselves to the other person. It's how we look. So, body language can involve, first of all, the whole body. So, as I've already said, when you're listening to somebody, give them your full attention. Use gestures sensibly. So be wary and be aware of using gestures that are unhelpful. A chopping hand, a pointing finger. So keep your hands, clasped in your lap, for example, or resting on the table. Or use positive hand gestures to animate your responses and to your conversation. Then think about your way of looking at somebody. Make sure your eyes are open and attentive. Established full eye contact. Think about how you're sitting. Are you sitting with your arms folded, which can sometimes look to the other person as though you're a bit blocked or closed? It may not be. It may be nothing of the kind for you, but it's how it looks to the other person. So, tip number 3, have open and positive body language. Tip number 4 is a specific form of body language, which is about the angle of your head. So tip number 4 is about being level-headed. If you're sitting down at the moment, or even if you're not, think about how the angle of your head is at the moment. If you are looking down, if your head is tilted and then you still try and look up at the other person, it will look a little bit kind of headmastery or matronly. You'll be looking up at the other person. If your head's tilted back and you're then still looking at the other person, you're sort of looking down your nose at the other person, which can give a supercilious, superior air. The thing to do is to keep your head angle parallel with the ground. What we mean by level-headed. And that gives the other person a sense of you being not superior, not supercilious, not seriously looking up at the other person in a sort of slightly aggressive way, but just being level-headed. So keep your head parallel to the ground, to the floor, and you'll be level-headed. Tip number 4 then, be level-headed. Tip number 5 is recap. I think this is a really powerful tool and one that's perhaps not used often enough. If you recap what the other person has been saying, it has a number of benefits. First of all, it's the absolutely best way of showing that you've been listening. You can't possibly recap what the other person has been saying unless you've listened. So it's a very powerful acknowledgement to the other person that you've paid attention and listened. Secondly, it's checking understanding. If you recap what the person has been saying, then the other person gets the chance to hear whether or not you've got it, whether you've understood what they've said. Thirdly, it values them. It shows you've been listening. You've not just nodded and you've not just said, yep, I follow. You've actually used some of their words and some of their ideas and played it back to them. So they're thinking, oh yeah, he has been listening. Oh yeah, he's got that. Or she's been listening. She's got that. So, finally, recap allows you to regain control in a conversation. If the conversation's going off track or the other person's getting a little bit agitated, a bit heated, a bit emotional, if you recap, they stop talking. It's inevitable because they want to hear whether what you're saying is right. So they'll stop to listen whenever you recap. And that's how you get them to calm down or to refocus. And it can help reset the tempo. If they're going at quite a lick, if they're fast talking, if they're being quite loud, you can use your recap voice to reset the tone. And the chances are that if they come back in on the recap, they'll come back in at a more moderate tone set by you. So, tip number 5, recap. Tip number 6, I call this cues and clues. Cues and clues. When you're chatting away in a conversation, reintroduce back to the other person some of the words or some of the phrases that the other person has used. It can be anything. In summary, in recap, you can say, so when you mentioned, or you can use a particular term they've used. So let's suppose they've been talking about how they've travelled and they got stuck on the motorway. And when they were stuck on the motorway, they were thinking about what they were doing this weekend, which is perhaps going to a concert. So later on in the conversation, you can say, so when you're at the concert next week or at the weekend, and it just drops in that you've been listening without formally going through a recap. to be able to play back that you've been listening just by picking up the occasional word or phrase that the other person has used. It also is a form of empathy, because if you're playing back some of what they've said using their language, you're establishing a closer connection to them. You're saying, I've listened to you, I've heard what you say, I'm using your way of speaking, your phrases. So, cues and clues. Listen for, then play back particular words or phrases that they use. Tip number 6, use cues and clues. Tip number 7 consists of 2 letters, A plus B. A plus B. And these 2 letters stand for acknowledge and build. It's really powerful in establishing rapport with the other person to acknowledge what they're saying and then ideally build on what they've said. So if the other person makes a comment and you don't pick up that comment at all, you don't acknowledge it in any way, the other person thinks, are you listening? Is what I'm saying of any value to you? So if you're talking about, I don't know, the difficulty of finding additional funding for a particular project, and you say, for instance, I'm not really happy with the temperature in this room, it's a complete disconnect. You're not acknowledging in any way that the other person has said anything and that it's of any value. So if they were to say, I'm struggling to find some funding for the next project, you could say, yeah, I can see that that's difficult in the current economic climate. None of us have much money. One of the things though that might be helpful, and that's the build. If you add value to what they're saying by suggesting a way of moving that issue forward, or simply saying it's something that you have a similar problem with, you're building on the other person's contribution. It's a way of acknowledging and building on their contribution. So, tip number 7, acknowledge and build. Tip number 8 is about empathy, showing empathy. And essentially, empathy is being in sync with the other person, being connected in a way that they can sense is supportive. It isn't necessarily being sympathetic, it's being empathetic. It shows that you're connected to them. So how do we do that? Well, some of the things we've already talked about. It's often about matching in a sensitive and subtle way how the other person is presenting themselves. So it can involve seating. So if the person is sitting, let's say, with their legs crossed, you can perhaps cross your ankles. If they're leaning with one elbow on their desk, you can lean on the desk. It's really important not to mimic the other person. It's not an identical match as if you were in a mirror. But it's just moving your body in a way that echoes to some degree how the other person is using their body. Or it's your tone of voice. Or it's the pace at which you work. I'm going to say more about that in the next point. So whatever you can use that echoes back what the other person is using is usually a way of establishing rapport and showing empathy. And you also show empathy by acknowledging what the other person is saying and showing that you have a recognition of that. But never say, I know how you feel, because you don't. But you can be empathetic through your language by saying such things as, I can see that's difficult. I recognise that that's a problem. It's an acknowledgement that you understand without being able to place yourself entirely in their shoes. Because how it is for them is personal, and you can recognise it's personal without saying you know how it feels. So tip number 8 is empathy. Tip number 9 is tempo. I just referred to that in the previous tip, but I want to say a little bit more about it. Most of us are somewhere between one of 2 types of language delivery. We're either quick or slow. And quick often is people who are what we call quick processors. They hear quickly what you're saying, and as soon as they've made sense of it, come back in with their response. So they don't listen necessarily fully to what you're saying. Once they've got what they think is the general point or idea, they're quick to reply. So they process your information very quickly and often interrupt with their response. Quick processors. Slower people tend to be what we call reflectors. They need to listen carefully to what's being said and think about it before replying. So a reflector would typically listen fully to what somebody's saying, then see if they make sense of it, and if they do, whether they want to reply, and if they want to reply, then they offer a considered reply, something that they've worked out and worked through. So what they say makes sense and is thoughtful. So some people tend to be quick processors and some people tend to be reflectors. And in order to establish rapport, it's helpful to be able to match that particular tempo of the other person. So if you're dealing with a quick processor, be quick yourself. If you're dealing with a reflector, slow down. Give them that space and time to reflect. So tip number 9, manage your tempo to match that of the other person. And finally, tip number 10, watch your language. The English language is hugely rich. There are, I think somebody said, 640,000 words we can use. And that gives us plenty of choices about the language, the words we use in any conversation. Now, the next podcast is going to be all about that, the use of language. So let me just give you one example of what we'll be talking about in the next podcast. Listen to the difference between I want to talk to you about or I'd like to talk to you about. Now, I'll say them again. I want to talk to you about and I'd like to talk with you about. The only thing that's changed there is 2 words. I've substituted in the second version like for want, and I've substituted to with. I want to talk to you about. I'd like to talk with you about. For most people, the first is a bit directive. It's a bit telling. I want to talk to you about. It separates the two of you. If you change it to I'd like to talk with you about, then like is a more positive, warm word, and with instead of to is collaborative. It equalizes the conversation. It's a shared conversation. So to is one directional, with is collaborative. Just by changing small words, we can make a big impact on how the relationship is and the conversation is going to go. So, those are my top 10 tips. Let me quickly recap them. Tip number 1, active listening. Tip number 2, asking questions. Tip number 3, use of body language. Tip number 4, being level-headed. Tip number 5, recap. Tip number 6, using cues and clues. Tip number 7, A plus B, acknowledge and build. Tip number 8, empathy. Tip number 9, tempo. And tip number 10, language, the use of words. That's it for this particular podcast. Thanks very much for listening. Bye for now. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, make sure you subscribe. You will still get the podcast for free, but you will also get an alert to let you know when the next podcast is available. And please recommend the podcast to anyone else you think might like it and benefit from it. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a review and any other comment, because they'll help promote the podcast series on the relevant platform. So, bye for now.